Hello, everyone. The Russia-Ukraine war is entering a historic turning point, where the Kremlin's strategic calculations on paper are facing the harsh reality on the fiery battlefield of Donbas in the southern front. The balance of power has been completely overturned through an unprecedented asymmetric war in modern military history. And here are the main points. Power has shifted sharply on the Donbas front, causing Russia to lose all offensive momentum. Lanchester's laws in the meat grinder, the dogmatic mistakes of the Russian General Staff, and the catastrophic casualty rates of the Storm Z and Storm V units. The defense industry crisis, the bottleneck flaw of the T-90M tank and its inability to secure high-tech components. The deep battle strategy, the EPOI system, and the shock raids 205 kilometers behind the front lines, turning the rear into a ring of fire. The summer domino scenario, the armored spearhead coordinated with drones, and the opportunity to cut off the land corridor connecting to the Zemir Peninsula. Here is the content and detailed analysis. The Zemir route is threatened, 600,000 of Putin's troops are trapped, and Russia keeps pouring in reinforcements in ever greater numbers, but to no avail. Ladies and gentlemen, at this decisive moment of the summer counteroffensive, a turbulent situation is unfolding across all Ukrainian front lines, completely overturning all calculations about the balance of power. Nevertheless, the Russian General Staff has not given up on testing strategic calculations on the ground, with the ultimate goal of seizing the entire Donbas region, including the fortified belt of strongholds and the southern defensive axis. From mid-March until now, the Kremlin has remained obsessed with this goal, maintaining a massive force ranging from 500,000 to 700,000 troops on Ukrainian territory to serve its pacification campaigns. Directly confronting this occupation ambition, according to opposition media sources from Belarus, is a solid steel shield of the Ukrainian army, currently believed to consist of 110 elite brigades steadfastly holding their positions. During the critical period from March to the early days of June, Moscow's leadership seems to have made a classic mistake in the art of warfare by underestimating the resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces, while also being overly confident in their massive reserve mobilization. The bold statements about pacifying Kiev within 3 days at the dawn of the conflict are the clearest manifestation of that strategic arrogance. According to data from United 24, the Russian army has accelerated its offensive across the Ukrainian battlefield to a staggering level, with exactly 7,000 separate assaults. However, in exchange for that unprecedented expenditure of resources, the land they managed to hold on to is only a mere 14 square kilometers. Increasing the attack rate to 37.5 but only achieving minimal territorial gains on the ground is solid proof of the severe tactical exhaustion of the Russian army. The geopolitical analysis becomes even sharper when realizing that the 14-kilometer advance in that area is actually a negative figure on the overall balance. The reason is that during the same period, the Ukrainian army successfully carried out fierce counterattacks in other strategic directions, liberating areas much larger than that. Experts, when analyzing in-depth initial data, all agree that this decline marks one of the most severe drops in combat motivation ever recorded. Notably, one of the locations that witnessed the most severe decline of the Russian army was Donbas itself. We're discussing a region that covers 2 of the 4 strategic areas President Putin insisted must be controlled from the start of the war: the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk. However, looking at the newly revealed actual data, the Kremlin's gamble on the war is hitting a dead end right in the Donbas hotspot. Looking back at history in 2022, Russia once imposed control over nearly 77% of the entire Donbas region. But as we enter the critical turning point of this June, the strategic balance has shifted in a surprising way in favor of the Kiev government. The defensive line of Krymean, Sloviansk, Luhivka, and the little-known Kutyntaika, which Ukraine calls the Fortress Belt, has risen like a wall. It is impenetrable to the Russian army's spearhead. Even though Mr. Putin's units have gone all out, mobilizing every available resource to destroy this defensive system, they are still being stopped on most of the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk front. The seriousness of this stalemate is even more evident in the statements of Mr. Pavel Gubarev, one of the early separatist leaders and one of the most fervent supporters of the war. In a frank assessment around May 2026, Gubarev publicly admitted that the cost was too terrible for any offensive campaign targeting the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk front. Gubarev's belated confessions, along with his call to freeze the front lines, have revealed the deep spiritual exhaustion gnawing at Russian nationalist circles. To break the strategic deadlock in Donbas, the Kremlin is having to resort to increasingly extreme measures. The fact that they are forced to bring outdated Soviet-era equipment back into combat service is a typical example. This move proves that tank models like the T-54, T-55, and T-62 have now become a vital lifeline for Russia, something they often try to disguise under the guise of military technical cooperation. A self-proclaimed military superpower, once the world's second strongest army, now relying on Cold War scrap metal, fully exposes the collapse of its logistics system. From another perspective, shifting a bit south from the northern and central Donbas, the Kremlin's bleak downward trajectory continues along the Donetsk strategic axis. The decline in the core combat capability of the 51st Guards Combined Arms Army, a unit once praised as an unshakable symbol of Russian military prestige around the Okhov axis, is the most accurate depiction of this exhaustion. The loss of a massive amount of equipment, up to 1,642 pieces of heavy weaponry, in just 10 months of combat is a disaster rarely seen in the history of modern warfare. Applying this classic combat mathematical model to the actual battlefield, any side that falls behind in terms of equipment quality and tactical thinking will have to pay an extremely high price. They are forced to increase their troop numbers and pour more equipment into the meat grinder at an exponential rate, not just a linear one, just to make up for the vast gap in combat capability. That's the harsh reality facing Moscow, as they are completely powerless against Ukraine's superior precision artillery firepower and swarms of drones. The Russian army is putting itself in a tactically suicidal position. The terrifyingly low survival rate of prisoner units like Storm Z and Storm V, when the Russian General Staff pushes them into heavily fortified terrain, is a direct result of this dogmatic deadlock. However, the deeply rooted disease and fatal weakness of the Russian war machine lies in the general's extreme refusal to acknowledge the brutal reality unfolding at the front lines. The lingering consequence of the outdated Soviet military doctrine is the pressure to constantly inflate achievement reports to present to superiors. It is this systemic disease of deception that has deprived the Kremlin of the ability to accurately calculate the actual casualty rate. So how was Ukraine able to pull off such a great strategic comeback in the face of countless adversities? The answer lies not only in the fiery Donbas region, but is also evident along the southern front lines of Ukraine through a highly flexible and professional style of warfare. The liberation of up to 590 square kilometers of vital territory on the southern front is proof of this. This clearly shows Kyiv is steadily regaining strategic initiative. Not stopping there, Ukrainian offensives continued to gain an additional 46 square kilometers around key junctions connecting the south with Donetsk, especially in the direction toward the lower reaches of the Dnipro River. The recapture of such a vast geographical area once again confirms that the Russian army is being pushed into a slow but irreversible retreat day by day. Ukraine has proactively shifted the focus of the war away from the entrenched front lines, directing their attacks straight at the logistical lifelines, which are considered the arteries sustaining the entire Russian army. The series of medium-range attack drones, capable of striking deep from 200 to 300 kilometers behind enemy lines, are the backbone of this highly innovative asymmetric warfare strategy. The critical land corridors stretching to Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, and even the Crimean Peninsula are now all under the total fire control of Ukrainian drone squadrons. Supporting this deep strike strategy is a bold decision from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, as they approved a special budget of $113 million, along with an entirely new incentive mechanism called a POI. Through this competition system, any military unit that successfully carries out the most effective logistical sabotage operations deep behind enemy lines will be rewarded quickly and directly. The real effectiveness of this program was demonstrated through the shocking raid on the Isfarai border, crossing in the far east of Luhan, a target located as deep as 205 kilometers behind the front lines. This unprecedented and daring strike is a statement that Ukraine is not only besieging active combat zones, but has turned the entire occupied rear network into a ring of fire. By cutting off fuel, ammunition, and basic supplies, the Russian forces are experiencing a significant decline in combat capability. Heavy logistics convoys, key ammunition depots, and even high-level command centers have suddenly become sitting targets in the face of concentrated firepower. The image of Russian supply trucks burning fiercely on the main routes in southern Ukraine, where they are under constant 24/7 surveillance, vividly illustrates the resounding success of this strategy. An army with a paralyzed logistics system will no longer have the mindset to organize offensives. They are forced to retreat and focus on the most basic survival instincts. Not stopping there, these deep strikes have also forced the Russian army to retreat, pulling their ballistic missile launchers and extremely expensive air defense systems further back, away from Ukrainian cities. At the same time, the emergence of FPV drones controlled by fiber optics has completely neutralized Russia's advanced electronic warfare systems, stopping armored convoys from kilometers away. This asymmetry in both technology and tactics has rendered Russia's numerical advantage on paper completely meaningless on the actual battlefield. Military experts consider it highly likely that Russia's defensive lines, which are suffering from severe disruptions in the chain of command, will collapse in a domino effect. The infiltration tactics outlined in the in-depth analysis by Rob Zobli represent a perfect art of maneuver warfare, meticulously adapted to meet the demands of the modern battlefield. The ability of Ukrainian armored units to immediately exploit enemy weaknesses by maintaining real-time seamless communication with command posts is now being taught as a new standard at Western military academies. The deployment of armored spearheads in this manner, especially on the Dnipro riverbank and the flat open plains in the south, carries the potential to completely sever the land corridor connecting Russia to the Zhymir Peninsula. Once this vital lifeline and transportation route is cut off, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, along with massive stockpiles and equipment on the peninsula, will fall into the trap of an irreversible logistical siege. Furthermore, Russia's industrial resilience and production capacity to withstand such a potential armored breakthrough have already been pushed to their absolute limits. According to reports from open-source intelligence organizations, while Russia's annual production of T-90 tanks is only about 240 units, their monthly losses on the front lines far exceed this number. Every modern armored vehicle destroyed and unable to be replaced forces Russia to deploy much older equipment with significantly weaker armor to the front lines, putting their personnel at far greater risk. In particular, the heavy reliance on Western-made components for advanced optics and thermal sensors on tanks has left Russia's defense industry in a complete deadlock due to strict sanctions. In reality, the number of damaged military vehicles waiting in line for repairs at factories has long far exceeded the capacity for new production. This is the clearest evidence that the Kremlin simply cannot sustain a long-term war of attrition on an industrial scale. Over time, these systemic shortcomings of the defense industry will likely force the Russian military to withdraw from other territories they currently control. By completely eliminating administrative procedures in the defense sector, the government has granted domestic manufacturers and civilian engineers an unprecedented level of autonomy. Thanks to the free market and this wave of competitive technological innovation, hundreds of different startups across Ukraine are working around the clock to develop the unmanned systems that the military needs. Structurally, Russia's cumbersome, top-down military apparatus cannot keep up with such a dynamic and innovative defense ecosystem. Ukraine's summer strategy is likely to broaden its focus, not just targeting specific geographic areas, but aiming to bring down the entire command and control apparatus across all occupied territories. In contrast, Russia faces extremely limited military options, full of risks and accompanied by a high political cost. The collapse of industrial capacity and the severing of logistical lifelines will force Russia to choose between a complete withdrawal into a passive defensive posture or gradually abandoning its front lines. In short, the overall picture is already very clear. The overall nature of this war has gone far beyond measuring which side gains or loses how many kilometers of territory. It has shifted to a phase that is intensely focused on breaking the enemy's will to fight and crushing their logistical backbone. The ingenuity and innovative military thinking and Ukraine's ability to use technology effectively have begun to crush a giant force. A giant is being completely bogged down by traditional doctrines under its own weight. From the fortified high points of the Donbas region to the southern plains stretching down to the Black Sea, strategic initiative has irreversibly changed hands. It seems that the Kremlin will soon be forced to accept a harsh truth. The grand parade they imagined years ago has crashed into the solid wall of battlefield reality, turning into a desperate and inescapable fight for survival. So in your opinion, what will Putin do to win this difficult and exhausting war? Or will he face a humiliating defeat if he doesn't use nuclear weapons?